Hi, welcome everyone to the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility's May webinar, Corporate Citizenship for Executive Leaders. My name is Sylvia Perez-Cass, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations here at ASER. I'm excited to have esteemed executive leadership from 3 Fortune 500 companies here to talk with us today about the importance of corporate citizenship at the executive level. We wanted to explore this topic in acknowledgement of the unprecedented events of the last year, with the understanding that employees' professional lives don't exist in a vacuum. Today's guests will reveal how corporate executives can address difficult societal circumstances within the context of the workplace, and why this is an important skill to develop in order to recruit and retain talent. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's first sponsor, General Motors. Thanks again to General Motors for being a longtime supporter of ASER and Hispanic inclusion. Now I'd like to introduce our second sponsor of today's webinar, Target.
"2020 turned our world upside down. We faced challenge after challenge. We changed how we work, play, and live, all while acknowledging the role we must play to create a more equitable world." Here at Target, we've had a long-standing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. These values are fundamental to our business, and they shape our culture. And we set goals every 3 years to align us on our priorities, and hold ourselves accountable to the progress we want to make as an organization. We're incredibly proud that the work we've done over the past 2 years has put us on the path to meet or exceed almost all of our diversity and inclusion goals. Since 2019, we've increased the representation and advancement of women and people of color. We've increased sales in product categories like beauty, toys, and food that help make us more relevant for all guests. And we're on track to meet our spending goal with diverse suppliers. We have more work to do to reduce turnover of team members of color, but we're encouraged that that work is in our sights and we're driving towards positive progress. Our efforts are making a difference in our stores and our communities, and they're helping us fulfill Target's purpose to help all families discover the joy of everyday life. We look forward to continuing this fabulous journey.
Thank you, Target, for being another longtime supporter of us there and a champion of the Hispanic community. We look forward to working with both General Motors and Target throughout this year and years to come. Our moderator for today is Marco Davis, President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute and a board member of ASER. Thank you for joining us today, Marco. We're so glad to have you here.
Hi, Sylvia. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here as well. And I guess I'll take it away. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Sid, and the whole ASER team for putting this event together. I'm really happy to be here, and I think this is a really important conversation. So we're going to get right into it. Once upon a time, all a company needed to do to be a good corporate citizen was maybe sponsor a local youth sports team or bowling league, award Christmas bonuses, and make occasional statements about how much they value the communities where they do business. And that was seen as enough, and companies largely stayed out of social issues or social statements because they viewed it as kind of not their area. But as we all know, the landscape has really begun to change, and in recent times, pretty dramatically. For one thing, a slowly growing but increasingly gaining momentum movement to focus on what's been described as ESG, environment, social, and governance aspects of the corporate sector has placed increasing pressure on them to weigh in on the kinds of things that everyday Americans are thinking about, worrying about, and talking about. Nowadays, corporate citizenship is seen through a much more detailed lens, and it's become nearly impossible for a corporation to completely ignore social issues. I think, like with so many other aspects of life, we've come to realize that we don't live our lives in these silos. They're not compartmentalized. And social issues affect the professional workplace and personal and family topics and concerns and obligations spill over into the public sphere, et cetera, right? Increasingly, the nation's consciousness, in fact, over the last year and a half, have seen social issues, some with political aspects, that have reached the nation's consciousness to such a point that, in fact, they require a response from everyone, including, in many ways, the corporate sector. Just think about the things we've been through. I don't need to tell you, but just to refresh all our memories, just over the past year and a half, we started with a global pandemic. That was followed closely by a much wider conversation about economic inequality that was revealed by the pandemic. The tragic murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others have created what some have called a racial reckoning or a focus on racial justice, and even the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. But then in this year alone, in 2021, we witnessed an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, something unprecedented, on January 6th. A brutal act of mass violence that raised awareness around anti-Asian hate and activity, an increase in the number of unaccompanied minors at our southern border, sometimes alternatively referred to as a surge or a crisis. And finally, if that weren't enough, a renewed debate about voting rights in various states throughout the country. It's quite a plethora of things. And as I said before, these were things sometimes that certain groups, certain segments, certain aspects of society might have talked about, might have been focused on. But increasingly, all Americans are finding themselves forming opinions, having conversations around these issues. And so, again, it's perhaps no surprise that the corporate sector has not been any different. In fact, something notable has been that there has been much more activity on the part of the corporate sector, whether it be statements or actual actions in response to this. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to have a conversation about all of this that's been happening, how it's happening, and finally, if and how having diverse leaders, such as Latinos and others, plays a factor into the role that corporations and the corporate sector play in having these conversations that are important in our society. Now, I have a few questions I'm going to ask the panelists on these topics, but for the latter portion of our conversation, before the hour is up, I'll begin to draw on questions that you, our audience, submit. So feel free to enter them throughout our time, and as I said, when we shift over to that portion, I'll begin to pull from the questions that you all submit to our moderators. We have an incredible lineup of panelists today, but in the interest of time, we're going to dispense with reading long and extensive bios on each of them. They're outstanding leaders. Hopefully you all have heard, if you don't know them, you've heard of them before, and if not, you can find quite a bit of information about them online. So in order to get right to the conversation, let me just very briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Ken Barrett, who's the Global Chief Diversity Officer of the General Motors Company. Hey, Ken.
Great to be here, Marco. Thanks.
Thank you. And joining him, we have Emilio Gonzalez, Executive Director of Policy and Strategic Alliances at Verizon. Hey, Emilio.
Hi, Marco. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And last but certainly not least, we have Melanie Parker, the Chief Diversity Officer at Google. Hey, Melanie.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining. All right. So let me start with a general question for all of you. Given your organizations, have your corporations had a history of involvement in social issues, whether it be statements or actions or in some other way? Or are you finding that this has been relatively new for your corporations? We've seen across the sector that there's a variety, right? Some organizations have always been pretty active and have not shied away from stepping into controversy. Others have found that this is a new muscle they're beginning to exert. So I wonder if you could share, maybe each of you briefly, what's been the experience at your particular corporations?
I'm happy to start.
Great.
I'll say one of the things I want to react to that you talked about in your preamble, I think is really important for all of us to keep in mind. And that's what we saw when we recognized that we didn't have a series of episodic events when we were watching racial injustice late spring, early summer last year. You know, we really are in a racial reckoning movement. But what we saw that's really important is that we saw a demand for companies and corporations to respond in a way that we really haven't before. And I believe that's because the corporations really are seen as a stronger partner, and some of the other structures that have typically had a role are seen as like more wobbly or not as stable. And so there's a stewardship component that comes with that I just don't want us to overlook here.
That's a great point.
At Google, for many years, we've supported comprehensive like immigration reform as an example. And so we've long supported, you know, social justice issues outside of the walls of Google. And part of what we've done with immigration reform, including confirming the status of DACA, is we continue to support our policymakers in Washington, really working on enduring and lasting solutions. So we proudly employ dreamers, work on build the products that you use every day. And then this year through Google.org, we were one of the first companies to make a grant to cover DACA application fees for dreamers. That's part of more than the $35 million we've donated over the years to support immigrants and refugees worldwide. So that's just one example.
That's great. Thank you.
Marco, I've been with Verizon a very long time, so I kind of feel like I've had a front row seat to the growth and evolution of the company. I could go back as far as 2003 when our CEO at the time, Ivan Seidenberg, was one of the first to lead a charge for calling for reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And I'll admit that that issue seemed a lot easier then than it is today. But I could fast forward to 2013 when we were, I think, one of the very first companies, along with Walmart, to publicly come out and endorse comprehensive immigration reform. And at that time, that was a dangerous maneuver. We really did not know what would happen next. Fortunately, it worked out, and the proof is that I'm here with you today. I could fast forward to the events around the tragic murder of George Floyd, where we responded not only with words, but with a $10 million commitment to African-American groups. for civil society, voter engagement, etc. And then before Atlanta, interestingly enough, we had been working and noticing the rise in anti-Asian racism and violence. We got our CEO to speak publicly about it at a forum and immediately began to work and release a $10 million wraparound commitment to our friends in the Asian American community that consists of pro bono work, donated media, and cash. So, all that to say, I'm delighted that the word responsibility has shifted to citizenship, and I think all these companies nowadays have to think long and hard about when and how to engage, but not just with words, but also with resources.
That's great. That's great. And Ken, tell us about the experience for you.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. And I think Emilio and Melanie are spot on, right? And I would say my response to your question is yes and. But it's different, very much to Melanie's point, right? So you kind of saw in the GM video, we actually had some of our firsts and all that. But I would say one of the driving forces for GM way back when, and we're talking, 50 years ago, more than that, in 1967, the riots in Detroit, the death of Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy. We decided at that point in time to really start to do something different. We started our supplier diversity program at that point in time. Also, we brought on Reverend Leon Sullivan, to our board of directors in 1971. And, he was the author of the Sullivan Principles. We were one of the first companies, us and IBM at the time, to stop doing business in South Africa because of apartheid. So, we've made major stands, right? So, we've taken some big time stands on critically important issues. But to Melanie's point, we've also made more statements now. We've always been in support of the Dreamers and DACA, comprehensive immigration reform. So that's the way we've kind of approached it, right? So comprehensive immigration reform is the statements our CEO is saying publicly, right? So they're involved in that. But now post George Floyd, I would say it's a totally different dynamic. We are basically involved in statements that we just never would have necessarily involved ourselves in. And Emilio mentioned a couple of them with, voting rights. We had a statement on that. The results of the Chauvin trial. We had a statement on that. So I would say that then also Asian hate as well. We made a statement on that. Typically, the difference to me is, on those types of things, we might have made an internal statement, kind of talking to our employees, reassuring them on how we stand, and that we support everybody and diversity and all those kind of very generic kind of statements, supporting our employees. But now, not only that, but we're also taking that public statement externally as well and making the commitments that Melanie and Emilio also, mentioned as well, to be more, proactive, intentional, thoughtful, on the side of, racial equity and social justice.
Well, thank you. And it is clear that we not only picked 3 outstanding leaders, but we also picked 3 outstanding representatives of companies who clearly have not shied away from taking a stand and who have not sort of been hiding in a corner before a year ago, right? And so it's great. And so, in fact, you all may be best suited to help some of us understand something I think we're curious to learn is, how does it happen, right? These are massive corporations with lots of people with many, many things on your minds and many concerns to worry about, right? Clearly, there's upsides, downsides to taking these stands and so on. So I'm wondering, and particularly as several of you mentioned, it's also taken a different tone or different facet in the last year or so, right? Where you're much more active. Is this something that is driven by the CEO? Is there a standing set of principles? Is there a standing process by which an issue gets raised so that then leadership makes decides? Like, how does it happen that your organizations have taken these very bold and courageous positions? Are there systems already in place to then sort of, rapid response? Or is this something that's grown organically and you've been figuring it out as you go? And if you don't necessarily all have to answer, if somebody wants to volunteer, maybe either with an example or just sharing, that'd be great.
Marco, in our case, it's helped a lot. I think it's a push-pull effect, right? Sometimes events happen out of nowhere and you have to react and respond. sometimes you have the luxury of planning and thinking through how you want to approach something. But in our case, I think we've been fortunate to have leadership that recognizes the importance of being a citizen in this time. And what I mean by that is, we've created a framework, a compass to help guide us in our decision making on any social issue. And it consists of four variables, right? Our customers, our shareholders, our employees, and then the stakeholder we broadly call society. And when we put things in the mix there, we see how it plays out in all four. So to go to comprehensive immigration reform, we not only advocated on this as a humanitarian issue, but also as an economic issue. And then there are cases where employees bring things to the company, and the CEO or the ERGs or chief diversity officers have to respond to that. So what I would say is that I think, and we have seen the pace of acceleration of issues and the requirement on our part to respond in a timely manner has accelerated. And it's a challenge, but it's a fun challenge in many ways.
We have a group at Google that has key members from our communities, from our communications team, from our HR team, and they're looking at like crisis management, and they meet on a weekly basis, and they meet more often as needed, because we're looking globally at what's happening, and we have various inputs. So our ERGs are very key input to community sentiment, to what's happening, but we have a structured process in place to really amplify our voice as a company and translate like that voice into actions as needed to address what we're seeing.
That's great. That's great. Ken, did you have anything to add? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just to build a little bit on that. And I think, again, Emilio and Melanie are spot on here. I would just say, too, the rate of or expectation has increased, exponentially. And I think a lot of that is coming from the more communications that we're having. Okay. And very much like Melanie was talking about, our ERGs, it's kind of a grassroots thing, right? They have particular, areas of interest, things that are very important to the constituency, and they want to be able to make sure they're vocal about bringing it forward. But to Emilio's point, it starts with leadership at the top. You've got to have leadership that's willing to engage. And I think we certainly do. All of us on this call have leaders who are willing to engage. So it starts with, leadership commitment at the top. And then from there, you can say how you're going to do it. And this is kind of to Melanie's point. You got to be thoughtful about it. You got to bring in different partners here. So, and she mentioned HR, and I would say others, our public policy or government relations team, our lawyers. Lawyers are going to have a say here, one manner, shape, or form. So they're going to kind of bring that. And I know everybody on this call is talk to many lawyers. Not to put down lawyers, love lawyers. I do. So I don't want you to feel that way if you're a lawyer out there. But we want to be able to understand the different perspectives that are coming, and then also from the constituency itself, and what are those issues that are important to them, and what must we speak up on. So I would say that we kind of work towards and I wouldn't say it's perfect. It actually seems like Emilio might have a better system, or they've worked it more, maybe just based on his response. But I would say we're certainly looking at thresholds, and when we actually make a statement, when we make an internal statement, an external statement, take a more specific stance on it. But I would also say too that we also look for partners, right? So we're a member of the Business Roundtable. And if we have a collective of companies that are also speaking out about it, we certainly are able to then kind of navigate that particular issue, get a broad base of support, and be there as a collective, really going forward and supporting an issue in one direction or another.
That's great. That's great. This is super insightful. Thank you all. And a couple of you mentioned, have referenced your ERGs, and for those who are not familiar, employee resource groups, right? So I'm wondering, are there any examples, or if not in general, sort of how would you describe the role that the ERG, particularly in our case, obviously our interest in the Hispanic ERG, in these processes, in these issues? Is there a time when maybe the Hispanic ERG brought an issue to the attention of the corporation and managed to raise it up to leadership's attention, or perhaps when they were consulted as the corporation was thinking? Because I assume a lot of our viewers are part of the ERGs at their corporation, and they're thinking about how to leverage that entity, that vehicle, in a way that benefits both the corporation and the community as much as possible.
I'll say, Marco, at Google, we have our OLA is our Global Employee Resource Group. We have over 5,500 Google employees across 35 offices, and they're dedicated to making an impact. And really, it's our Hispanic, Latinx, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Black, Brazilian, Latino, and we have allies as well. So and then we have a Latinx Leadership Council. So there are 15 Latinx executives who work side by side with our leaders in OLA so that they're visible, proximate, committed to advancing Google's DEI goals of belonging, progression, really looking at external community engagement in addition to internal, and then product inclusion. It's how we make sure that the voice is heard on behalf of communities in the products that we build. And, I give it as an example, some of like our mentorship programs, advocating for Latinx initiatives, and really making sure that we've customized programs and are pairing Latinx executives across OLA so that we are giving visible access and opportunity. And then where we have another example of integrating the Latinx perspective into performance evaluation process and other key systemic drivers. And so we're on a goal really looking at systemic and structural barriers and making sure that we're culturally competent, and our leaders, most importantly, are culturally competent as well. So that's just a few examples.
That's great. Super helpful.
Marco, and I would just add to what Melanie said on the ERG front. I think for those looking or just starting out on that road or to build up their capacity there, I think we've learned there are three factors for successful ERGs. And one is to have a champion for each ERG that is from the C-suite, right? So as issues arise and opportunities present themselves, you have someone who can directly take that to the board and to the CEO. The other thing that I think has been helpful with ERGs is to ensure that we offer a culture and a safe harbor for them to have the conversations necessary. So after the events in Atlanta, I also manage Asian American affairs for the company, and I participated or listened really to a conversation that our Asian American employees had. It was extremely powerful. I mean, it was moving, the personal stories that they told about how this impacts them, their parents, their children. And it made us feel more committed to what we were doing because we recognized it impacts our employees. And if our employees are happy, I think our bottom line will reflect that. And finally, we consult them when we take positions, whether it's on DACA or LGBT issues that we support, or or the George Floyd matter for all that. What would you like to see us do, and what words would you like us to say? So it is a great validator to connect with them, and to any company looking to build that. I think those three factors are necessary for success.
That's great. Anything to add, Ken, or should we?
Yeah, I'll build. I keep building on these, but they're two great responses here, and I would say that we do each of the ERGs, employee resource groups, do have a business plan with like 4 main pillars. One of them is to try to attract talent from their constituency into the company, and being able to make sure we have a good onboarding situation there. There's also a talent development piece of things, whether it's mentoring, sponsorship, really being able to understand career development and being able to have that connection there. It's connecting with your constituency, understanding what the dynamics are there, and bringing that information back into the company. And hey, we're an automotive company. The last one is to sell cars, trucks, SUVs, and crossovers, right? So looking at ethnic share of brand, Hispanic share of brand, how are we doing with our brands across that? And I would say, so really integrating them into the business is critically important to get their voice out too. And, I would say that the things that I'm most proud about with respect to the ERGs is they aren't silent, right? And you have to, you really have to do there. And I would say really post George Floyd, we've made commitments like I know all our companies on this call have, but one of them from our chair and CEO was to be the most inclusive company in the world and not being afraid of those conversations. We see you, we hear you, and we speak up, okay, is what we've kind of committed to. So with that, it's kind of back to my other response is like now there's so much, and maybe it was pent up, maybe there's been a desire to do this all along, and now we've actually taken a much more, proactive position, and their expectation continues to grow. And so I think that all of us that are on this call are pretty tired. At least I am, because I would tell you there's so many different things that are coming from many different angles. And to Emilio's point, I would say our Asian Connections community has done the same thing with, what the events in Atlanta and other Asian hate. So really facilitating action from the company, not just statements, but actual commitments to be able to, fund $1 million against anti-Asian hate, and even recently with the COVID stuff in India, $200,000 donation to support our employees in that area and 3 million masks. So, I mean, it could be a political thing. It could be something that's happening, just dynamics, but their constituency is hurting. They want a response. So.
That's great. That's great. So just a couple more questions and then we'll go to the Q&A. Hopefully folks are sending in their questions. One of the things I want to focus on, and you all have alluded to this already, in fact, so I just want to dig a little deeper on there. Looking at some of HACER's main areas of focus, in addition to employment, it's procurement, it's philanthropy, and it's governance, right? Those are the four areas. And so one of the things I want to ask you all is about how you feel. It's a two-parter, right? You might combine your answer. One is how you feel your corporation is doing and what can be done to help increase representation among Latinos and other people of color at the leadership ranks, right? We know that this is something across the board. It's sadly sort of a broader societal challenge. It's not any one particular corporation that's doing so much worse than others, or sadly, there's not enough doing as well, so much better than others. Everybody, I think, needs to help raise that bar. And to what extent might that be helpful or play a role in helping the corporation continue? Because I would say, I think you all have demonstrated your corporations don't just make statements, but you take an action, right? And as a favorite phrase I've loved to hear many times is show me your budget and I'll tell you your priorities, right? How is it that you all think your corporations can continue, and hopefully leadership is one way to do it, to make the investments, right? Whether it be focusing on the segment of the market as you deliver your products and services, or vendors, right? Procurement or philanthropy, right? As you make, and again, as you all have talked about, you've made tremendous commitments to communities at the time of most need. But how do we sort of keep that going? And how do we keep an eye on a focus so that it's not with sort of a kind of a thoughtful, careful analysis about where there's strategic and important need, not just response to crises, right? Because I think everybody agrees that that's not necessarily the most efficient or ideal way, is to only be making massive commitments when there's something tragic that happens. Ideally, we'd like to prevent that from happening. So big question, but hopefully I made it clear enough if anybody would like to take a stab at answering.
There's a lot to unpack there, Marco, but
I'm trying to work it all in the 10 or so minutes we have.
Real quick, I think just to establish the baseline along the pillars that HACER monitors, tracks, and reports on, when it comes to governance, we have one of the most diverse boards in America. In fact, as of yesterday, I think 5 of our 9 independent board members are racially, ethnically diverse. On the procurement front, we are one of the 30 companies that make up the $1 billion roundtable, but we far exceed that. So for 2020, we spent upwards of $5 billion last year with women and minority-owned vendors and suppliers, and we don't just leave them out there to compete and figure it out. We hold boot camps for them. A few of them are brought in-house and mentored under executive leadership, and we ask our prime vendors. We put a premium on including diverse suppliers at the secondary level to build them up. And then finally, there's the employment piece. Today, I believe 43% of our U.S. workforce is ethnically and racially diverse. And, to borrow a term from the automotive industry, there's always a higher gear. We can and will do better, but there's a lot to unpack there. But I think it helps us when we've advocated on social issues. For example, it helps that we have 43% of our company is racially and ethnically diverse. We get comfort in that. So I hope I've answered at least part of the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I can chime in and help. I think you did a great job framing that out, Emilio. And I'll say, at Google, we help create economic opportunity as well through support to small business, to founders and startups, and then definitely in how we're building those products for change. Specifically to leadership, one of the ways that we've deepened our commitment is through the racial equity work that we've done over the last year. So we've set goals through 2025, so increasing our executive leadership ranks by 30% by 2025. We've created goals for our non-leader population as well. And so I report quarterly to the Alphabet board as well as to our CEO and his team to keep that dialogue going. We send a transparency report as well. And then annually, we do provide a lot of transparency into the work that we're doing, into the progress that we're making through our diversity annual report. And we've done that since 2014. So we have the largest publicly available DEI data set, and you can track that progress that we've made. So I often refer to Google as we're leaders and learners, and we do both transparently so that we can bring others along. The journey that we're on, looking at systemic and structural barriers, is really critical because we're standing in the work, really trying to get to what is the root cause, because we have to embed into the systems, practices, and approaches new competencies and deepened capabilities to make sure that these are enduring changes that we're making, not just like a flash in the pan, or this is something that you're going to see over the next few years. And it takes more time because there's the reality of what we say we're going to do, but then there's the reality of the work. And when you stand in the work and we're getting closer to what needs to happen, it takes time to really do that. But that's the journey and the commitment we're on, because we're interested in enduring equity, both internally and externally.
That's great. Thank you. Ken,
Yeah, no, I think Melanie brought up one really critical point, I think, and that's around transparency of data. I think that, we certainly have metrics and measures from overall population to new hires, but then we have measures along, what does our high potential pools look like? What do our promotions look like? What's attrition looking like? How are we doing on performance evaluations? And breaking it out by race, ethnicity, and gender, and being able to understand the dynamic. I think knowledge is power, right? And it drives decision making, and breaking it out by individual functions to be able to say, hey, this is what your data looks like. So certainly we have metrics to be able to do that. And this is kind of to Emilio's point. He was talking about leadership commitment to actually get involved with, intentional, promotions into executive and senior executive positions. I think it's important to be able to kind of have that as part of your overarching strategic plan. So we have key strategic initiatives. We call them KSIs at General Motors, and diversity and inclusion is in there. So not only do we have diversity metrics, we also have inclusivity index, so along with engagement scores. So being able to be intentional on how you're looking at any individual constituency and where we expect to find talent. But it needs to be broader than that. You need to be able to open the aperture and be able to seek new pools of talent. We're a manufacturing company. So I would say on our salaried side, we're talking 75% of all our hires are in the STEM and IT fields, probably not unlike the others on the call here. So, I mean, we're all in this battle for talent. And so you have to have, strong key partnerships with Hispanic serving institutions. We do a lot with the Society of, Hispanic Professional Engineers and HENAC, great minds in STEM. So being able to have, and we've had long-term relationships. And if you want to be able to be successful, you have to be proactive and actually be engaged here. So we talked a lot there, and I know we're getting close on time, so I could go on, but I won't. But I'll turn it back over to you, Marco.
That's great. Thank you each for that. I mean, very insightful set of responses there. I think that really shed light on a lot of these aspects of the issues. The one last thing I'll ask before we get to some of the audience Q&A questions, what might be an area that still needs more work? Where do you think, either for your corporation or the corporate sector writ large, where do you think we're still needing to figure things out, right? Where is there not necessarily, or where is there need to be more focus and attention to come up with solutions or make better progress? Are there things you find, again, that either you or your peers in the corporate sector are still wrestling with that folks should think about trying to help resolve?
I think it's culture. So particularly in the role that I have leading diversity, equity, and inclusion, at Google, like, we're all talking about belonging, but if we think about what belonging really means and the science behind it, it's that primary fear that we won't be included. And because of that, we cling to people and groups who are least risk. Least risk are people who are like you. So that creates these in groups and the out groups. And if you contrast that with what's happening like in our global society, you get to pick who you want to interact with. And so it's really, if you think about it, the workplace where you're probably going to come in contact with people from more backgrounds that you typically aren't doing in personal life because of the ability of choice that we have, where we live, where we drive, where we go, all of that. And so I think that's an area that we can all benefit from. It's an area that we're taking very seriously at Google. And I often say, being invited is not the same as being welcomed. And until everyone has the same lived experiences inside the walls of Google, we haven't gotten there yet. And so we're very focused on making sure that people from different backgrounds, different views, different experience can show up and really work together and have experiences at parity.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a colleague of mine once said something I thought really wise in talking about DEI issues, where they sort of said, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance, right? And I think that's sort of the cultural aspects that you're talking about. Emilio,
Marco, I think I'm glad you raised this. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for any company and ERGs, et cetera, to take this moment and build allyship across all groups. Mm-hmm. So I've learned a lot about this recently, dealing with the Asian American issue and how important it is for us as a company to connect them in some conversations with our African American ERG, our Latino, and others. Because a lot of these issues do cut across all communities, all races and ethnicities. The other point I would make, though, is I think Latinos and Latinas need to be very intentional in their careers right now, because if there's an area where I think corporate America as a whole struggles, is in the numbers of Latinos, Latinas in the C-suite and on boards. Mm-hmm. I just saw some data on it, and I'm not sure that needle has moved very much. But when you talk to our marketing folks, or you talk to anybody in marketing in any major corporation, this is one of the most significant markets out there. So I would just say I think there's a lot of work there, and I'm optimistic that 10 years from now it'll be much better.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Emilio. And Ken.
Yeah. So I'm going to agree with Melanie, like I've done on most of this conversation. The big thing around culture, I think, is certainly something that how do you measure that? I talked a lot about diversity metrics, and, we certainly built in, 8 inclusion questions, if you will, kind of broken out in 4 areas: valued and belonging, safe and open, empowered and growing, and respect and equity. into the data bank. So you not only get an engagement score, but you also get an inclusivity index. I think a lot of this is new ground for a lot of folks in the DEI space, and being able to come to terms with, are we really making a difference to be, we've made the statement, we want to be the most inclusive company in the world. So how do we know we're making progress to that end? And I'd add one more thing, Marco. I think the equity piece is also a big one. Internal equitable outcomes internally to the organization. Where are there particular spots where this is not occurring? Being able to delve down into each one of those processes to understand where inequities exist. And then externally for equity, how do you actually involve yourself as a good corporate citizen to take on those challenges that we have out there with respect to equity, and being positioned to where the things you're doing, it's not just words, as you said, Marco, before, there's actions, things that you're actually doing to kind of move the needle.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you all for those very insightful responses, and I think really great areas I think that we can all continue to focus on and do the work ourselves and add pressure, right, to positive, constructive pressure to move in those directions. All right, a couple of questions from the audience that I wanted to get into. One relates to Amelia just referred to the boardroom, right? And it's clear that we need more diversity in the boardroom, but this question was particularly related to our topic on corporate citizenship. Does do these issues, these social issues, and this question of corporate citizenship, does it show up at the board level in terms of their conversations? Do they play a role in the corporation's stance and positions and actions? Are they wrestling with these issues? Is it on their meeting agendas, do you know? Or is it something more that happens at the executive level?
I report to our board quarterly, and it is up, top of mind, and we do talk about it, and we show progress as well in the types of things that we're doing. And so these are things that our board members are wrestling with themselves and want to make sure that we have front and center. And then we're very interested in their insight and recommendations too.
That's great. Anybody else want to?
Yeah. Go ahead, Amelia. Go ahead. All right. Well, so I would say we always were on the agenda at the board of directors. I would say it's, and maybe Melanie's always had it quarterly. I wouldn't say we were there. We were probably more of a semi-annual kind of update, and it was very specific. Some of it around diversity and succession planning and those types of things. Now I'm telling you, it's a topic across the board, right? So looking at what we're doing, we've added an inclusion advisory board, so report outs from them to be able to understand, which has external and internal members to kind of drive some of the actions that we're taking as a company. So I would say it's basically a quarterly drumbeat now to say, hey, this is what we said we're going to do. This is what we've done. This is what we're going to do next. And I say from a standpoint of having it be the responsibility of the board, it is the responsibility of the board to drive this. And so I think it's always kind of been there, but I would tell you it is certainly front and center now.
That's great. Amelia?
I would just quickly add, I live here in the militarized zone, also known as Washington, D.C., and this has to be on every board's agenda because just like the pandemic had a significant impact on how we operated as companies in our markets, these issues, when Washington was basically shut down and we had massive protests, our stores were not open, right? We were not selling devices then. And we could say that for many cities where we've had unrest. So not only is it a social and a rights issue, but it's also a business issue at the end of the day.
That's great. Thank you for that. All right, a question that I'm sure is near and dear to my colleagues at HACER. But I think this is interesting because, again, you all have shown just tremendous, I think, leadership, both yourselves individually and your corporations. So the question is this. HACER does its annual corporate inclusion index, right? It collects data and tracks and measures progress around these best practices, particularly in terms of Hispanic inclusion. But interestingly, there are some companies that express concern about sharing their data, about responding to the questionnaire and providing that data. And we can speculate around reasons, right? They worry if they're not going to score high enough, et cetera, and they think sort of shying away from it. and of course, one of the things is it's hard, I think, to exert sufficient pressure on them to respond, right? If they have those concerns. So the question was, what kinds of things could be said, or for example, could employees say at their own corporations to encourage these corporations to be more transparent? What are the arguments or the rationales about providing that data transparency, about tracking those metrics, and about being open about them? How would you encourage any of your colleagues to help move that forward, to apply that positive peer pressure?
Well, there are positive and negative ways to do that. I recall years and years ago, some of our competitors in the industry were not responding to HACER. And, at various times I used it as a competitive advantage with either a member of Congress or a policymaker or the media to say, well, I'm not so sure about their credibility given that they won't even do X, Y, and Z. Not my favorite tactic. I'd rather go with love and encouragement. But look, the era of transparency is upon us. There's no getting away from it. That genie's long out of the bottle. And I think the expectation of shareholders, consumers is, I want to know what I'm buying and what that company stands for. So I think in the end, it is a positive for anyone to be transparent.
That's great. That's helpful. Either of you, Ken? It looks
I'm sorry, Melanie. I just got to say that Emilio, he exudes love, man. I can see it. I just absolutely see it. I think it's important to, just kind of think about it intentionally again. I think it's incredibly important to understand that we're on a journey and you want to get better. I mean, I think when I look at the HACER Corporate Equality Index that, I'm able to kind of rack and stack how we're doing. And I don't really know how you get there, especially in the Hispanic environment, without actually looking at this survey. It is such a robust survey. Now it's a little bit long, so maybe I got to talk to Sid about that. Maybe cut down a few questions here or there. That'd be nice. But I'm not complaining. But I think it's great for us to be able to understand where others are, and I do look at, how people have done on this survey. And I think it's good to question what we're doing. If I get a low score on something, I should be asking the questions why anyway. It's good for just being a good company to understand where you're having, pain points. And also, I would say working with HACER, they're always willing to help you, So, I mean, if there's something that you have that you really are struggling with, they've got experts that can actually help you try to address those concerns. So to me, it's incredibly valuable. So I'll try the love like Emilio does and try to be much more positive with carrots to other folks to encourage them to take it.
That's great. And Melanie?
I do think Emilio is right that love always works. A little bit of sweetener helps with that. But I think it's a business issue. I do think it's a great way, the part of the question about what can employees do internally, it's a great space for employee resource groups to come together to, express to the company leadership, like how valuable it is to community, not just to see the company represented, but how, to Ken's point, how the company is represented relative to peer companies as well. And my guess is there's likely fear behind it. And so how do we address the fear and that this isn't punitive? This is really about the transparency. And I agree it is the year of transparency. How do we use this as a way to learn, not to punish? And so I think we have to really push on what's holding companies back from being more transparent. Certainly, we've seen more companies come forward with diversity annual reports, transparency reports, but I think it's fear.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, each of you. So we're almost at time. I just wanted to see if I can ask this question. It's a tricky one, and we won't have enough time, I think, for expansive answers. But I think if you all at least want to think about signaling, referencing any aspect of this, maybe the way I might phrase it, that I'm trying to sort of pack what the way the question was framed. have you all seen in the evolution of corporations, either at your corporation or in the corporate sector in general, have you seen a dynamic where the corporations have begun to acknowledge, in part of their actions and part of their statements, their own history, right? The ways in which they may not have been as strong allies in the past, the ways in which their own practices or actions may not have been as productive, as inclusive, et cetera. How are corporations, because I got to imagine that's something that gets raised at some point. And so I'm wondering, how do corporations navigate that? And that, I mean, honestly, I think, again, all of us, right? There's no probably entity or segment of society that has never committed an error, has never been necessarily, has never been 100% positive agent of change, right? So how are companies sort of navigating that? Is that conversation even happening, or do you see that a way through for that?
I can start here, and I'll be brief, but absolutely that conversation is happening. I mean, Google is a very young company compared to the other companies represented here, but even as we internally and externally talk about like our beginnings and where we are now and what's changed, like the plethora of schools, we now recruit from over 800 schools, and that's a change from the handful of schools we recruited at, you know, in our early roots and our early beginnings. And we've moved away from conversation about meritocracy to equity, and using data to really power our progress and do customized or targeted solutions based on where the data recognizes we need to do better.
That's great. That's a great piece.
You know, Marco, one of the things I find so encouraging is, you know, we can always look back and find things that were not right. But as we look forward, I think every corporation, and hopefully every corporation does this, but I'm really encouraged to see us leaning forward on the environmental, global warming, sustainability, making commitments to when we will go carbon neutral, et cetera. So that's part A of it. And then on the social front, you know, we are a big part of the internet, right? And it has tremendous value. It has changed the way we work and live and interact. There are also some elements of it that I think industry has to step forward and work together to help solve. It's highly complex, but we want the internet to be around a long time, but we want it all, you know, we all want it to be a force for good.
That's great. And super quick, if you've got anything to add, Ken, before we wrap.
Yeah, I think we've committed to zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion, and that we will stop making internal combustion engines by 2035. So, I mean, I think, I'm not saying that's an ill or anything like that. I'm just saying that, hey, it is, and I think we're trying to make progress. And just being able to take a look at the social issues, I think we've been engaged in a lot of them, but I think being able to be reflective on, did we really do something that had impact? And I think that that's the question, back to Melanie's point on equity. You know, are there equitable outcomes that are occurring based on our actions? So, I mean, we're looking at, hey, is this investment? It's not just another, convention or sponsorship here. This investment is actually making a difference. And so to me, that's really been the focus, and I see it. I can, see it every day now.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to, in fairness, I want to acknowledge that I didn't phrase it right, but in the question they did mention, I think you all spoke to it, that they did talk about how companies have played a role consciously or unconsciously, right? So it's not necessarily like specifically where a company has been deliberately trying to cause inequity, but sometimes, again, inadvertently, right? And so I think, again, you all mentioned that in your answers. And so I think I really appreciate that, because there's both sides of that aspect of reflection, right? And of ownership. And I think leaning forward, as Emilio said, is great. All right, well, we're out of time. I cannot keep prolonging this. Folks are going to drop off. So thank you so much to our panelists. It's been a tremendous discussion. I hope all of our viewers have really appreciated everything that they've heard, that we've talked about today. I want to thank each of you, Ken, Melanie, and Emilio, for being here with us today. I want to thank the sponsors for underwriting this event and making it possible. We really appreciate that. And of course, I want to thank the entire HACER team for making the conversation possible as well, for putting together this tremendous panel and helping us through and address this particular topic. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Sylvia Perez-Cash, the Senior Vice President of Operations at HACER, to close us out.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much for being our moderator today. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Melanie, Ken, and Emilio for joining our panel and sharing your expertise on corporate citizenship. Most importantly, what that means today. And I think all of you reflected on very well on how that has shifted over time and where it needs to go in the future. This was a truly candid and open conversation that I know our HACER audience appreciates. So I can't thank you enough, all of you. We appreciate the time everyone took to join us today online. Those who are viewing this broadcast live, thank you for joining us and participating. Thank you for the questions. I'd like to remind all of you to find out more information. If you'd like to find out more information about HACER's events and our upcoming events, you can visit us at hacer.org, HACR.org. Registration is now open for our executive programs, which is being held virtually on June 15th and 16th of this coming month. This is a 2-day conference and it's centered around executive leadership development. Please also make sure to sign up by the end of this week if you want to take advantage of our early bird pricing. We have our next free webinar as well coming up on June 24th, and more information will be available on that. If you're interested in learning more, make sure that you sign up for our newsletter or just preemptively register for the webinar. We look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you so much for being with us today.